I'm Kyle Kramer, and I'm the Executive Director of the Earth and Spirit Center, a nonprofit interfaith spirituality center in the Louisville Highlands. Our mission is to teach contemplative practices like mindfulness and meditation for personal healing, flourishing communities, and growing more deeply in our relationship with the rest of the natural world. As we continue to navigate the brave new coronavirus world, mental health concerns can get lost amid our focus on physical and economic health. In our various ways, though, all of us are going through a traumatic experience right now, whether it's as major as losing a loved one to COVID-19 or losing a job, or as relatively minor as staying cooped up at home with your newly homeschooling kids. For some of us, this trauma is its own animal, and for others, it's bringing up past traumas as well. As a clinical psychiatrist in private practice here in Louisville, Dr. Chris Schrodt has been busy seeing patients during this crisis. He and I got together at a safe physical distance to talk about his experience as a mental health practitioner during this time. Chris is also a lifelong meditator and serves as an instructor at the Earth and Spirit Center, so mindfulness practices are central in his counseling and in his own life. At the Earth and Spirit Center, we're trying to provide resources to help you make it through COVID-19 with equanimity, kindness, and an open heart, not only to survive it, but so that we can all come out different and better on the other side of it as individuals and as a community. I hope listening to this conversation with Chris will give you good insights and tools to manage your own mental health and to reach out however you can to whoever may be struggling.
We all have moments where we have deep understanding. It's there. When we tap into being in the present and when we see we're maybe being too reactive, we can start to see the compassion arise in ourselves.
Dr. Chris Schrodt is a psychiatrist in private practice, a lifelong meditator, and a mindfulness meditation instructor at the Earth and Spirit Center. I'm your host, Kyle Kramer, the Executive Director of the Earth and Spirit Center, a nonprofit interfaith spirituality center in Louisville, Kentucky. We're committed to enhancing spiritual, social, and ecological flourishing through contemplative practices like mindfulness and meditation. Chris and I got together at a safe social distance to talk about the coronavirus pandemic and how mindfulness offers creative ways to deal with the trauma, fear, and anxiety that COVID-19 is causing so many people. So Chris, I'm so glad that you were able to be a guest with us on the Earth and Spirit podcast. And I'm wondering if we might start out by you sharing a little bit about your own journey with mindfulness. I know that you have been at this for quite some time. You started very young with mindfulness. So how long have you been practicing, and what drew you to mindfulness in the first place? What role has it played in your life, both personally and professionally?
So I actually started meditation when I was 15 years old. I was introduced to transcendental meditation. I had siblings who actually did some transcendental meditation and started to get interested. And as soon as I started practicing when I was 15, I was kind of hooked right away. I was very diligent even at that age. So I would meditate.
As only a zealous 15-year-old can be, right?
As a zealous 15-year-old would be. So I would meditate 20 minutes twice a day, every single day.
Some of us might not even admit to hitting that record as grown-ups.
And then, so I was practicing, and then I ended up going to the University of Kentucky. And while I was there, I met my first mindfulness meditation teacher, who's still one of my teachers and one of my friends. And he had me practicing, and we still joke about it. He said, at minimum, you should practice an hour twice a day. So I would practice 2 hours a day and then started to do meditation retreats. So early on
You realize that pretty much all of our listeners are going to tune out now, right? If you're setting that high a bar.
Well, yeah, he set a fairly high bar. He says, I don't remember saying that. I was like, yeah, you actually told me to do that. But my interest and my practice deepened pretty quickly. And then I had kind of a break a little bit because I was practicing a lot for several years. And then I went to medical school, which really
didn't leave you 2 spare hours a day.
Didn't leave me 2 spare hours a day. But, I had some mentors in medical school who actually very much supported the idea of meditation. It was kind of the beginning of kind of mind-body medicine at the time. This was back in the 1980s. And I finished medical school, did an internship, and then I actually took 2 years off after my internship.
From meditation or from practicing medicine?
From practicing medicine.
Okay. Because, of course, you would not take 2 years off from meditation.
No, I would not take 2. In fact, part of why I did it was to really kind of explore more meditation. So during that 2-year period, I did a lot of meditation retreats, was able to really get a strong daily meditation practice again, and started to just try to contemplate how I actually wanted to kind of integrate, meditation into the practice of medicine, though, I didn't realize how groundbreaking all of that was. So. But then, my whole career in psychiatry has been integrating, mindfulness-based practices and an understanding of how meditation and the principles of kind of, Buddhist psychology fit into this Western model. I mean, it's just completely exploded with the research now and how we kind of conceptualize it. I mean, at this point, it's fair to say that really the main advancements in psychotherapy in the last 15 to 20 years have been based on mindfulness principles.
Is that right?
Yeah.
So I know a little bit about your practice, and it feels to me like mindfulness is not a bolt-on with what you do, but it is really integral in your approach. Even if you don't necessarily deploy those tools explicitly, it's kind of the backbone of how you work.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty much the foundation for how I think about every person who comes to see me, even if they're there just for medication. I think it's really, this understanding of meditation and how the mind works and how the mind uses whatever tools it can to kind of cope with the world and end suffering. It's all completely informed by kind of my understanding of meditation. I had somewhat of an advantage, when I look back on it, and the advantage mainly being that I practiced meditation and really studied meditation before I became a psychiatrist.
Right.
So that was actually more the foundation, and the psychiatry's on top. I think, a lot of therapists, they've already kind of formed a worldview based on their psychotherapeutic approach.
And then added mindfulness.
And you can actually kind of tell the difference, I think.
Interesting.
Because, again, everything, the way that I practice, it's all informed by that. And that doesn't mean that I teach everyone who comes to see me meditation. I don't. Not everybody is actually a candidate to practice mindfulness at particular times in their life. So I might teach them other meditation techniques that are peripherally related to mindfulness, but not mindfulness per se.
Chris, what is your basic working definition of mindfulness? We jumped right into your practice and how you've integrated that, but what is mindfulness for someone who's hearing a podcast like this and they've only heard about mindfulness kind of out of the corner of their ear and they're not all that familiar?
Mindfulness is a quality of mind that allows one to be present and accept whatever is arising in consciousness without trying to change it or alter it in any way. It's being able to be present with whatever's there, the term completely in the moment, but it's completely in the moment without any reactivity of the mind. And it's a quality that's cultivated, and it's cultivated through kind of application of training in mindfulness. And as it develops more and more and more, this ability to be present, this ability to be non-reactive to what's arising gets stronger and stronger in the mind. What's important, though, is to understand, what's ultimately the point of it? And the ultimate point of cultivating this ability to be mindful is to kind of see clearly 3 fundamental aspects of reality. And in the tradition that mindfulness comes from, this is really the point of doing the practice. And the 3 basic things that our mind is supposed to become mindful of is the fact that what arises in the mind, the contents of mind, first of all, are impermanent, meaning they're fleeting. They're not as solid and definitive as we think they are. Another aspect that we want to gain insight and wisdom into is the fact that what arises in consciousness, which, again, consciousness being thoughts, feelings, images, body sensations, emotions, whatever tends to arise in our experience, that these things are not self in any definitive way. They do occur in our mind. They are part of our experience, but they are not defining of who we are. And as one cultivates mindfulness, one starts to see that that's the case. And when you start to see that that's the case, it actually softens the mind, and you start to not get so caught up in certain patterns of behavior, certain aspects of your mind that tend to kind of keep us stuck.
Because you've created some kind of distance between those and your, I even hate to say it, yourself.
Yeah, but it's really, it's again, seeing the self, that it's just these phenomena that are occurring. Mm-hmm. And the last thing that we gain wisdom to, which kind of wraps the first two together, is that our suffering, our unsatisfactoriness with experience, when we have unpleasantness arise in our mind, it's because we don't understand the first two. We don't see things as non-self. We over-identify with aspects of our mind. This is me, this is who I am, this is me, mine. And we don't see what arises in the mind as impermanent, that these things arise, they pass away. I mean, when I've talked to patients that I've seen through the years, I basically, sometimes ask them the question, so have you had any mind state that's actually lasted? And if they reflect on it for even a short amount of time, they'll realize, no, it all changes, because the only mind state there is in that moment is the mind state of them sitting there listening to me, and everything else is come and gone.
Although we tend to be pretty good at latching on to things and keeping them around.
A little bit. We tend to do that a little bit. And that ends up being the difficulty.
Yeah.
That's where the suffering is.
I have been noticing that the word suffering is coming up a lot in a lot of my conversations. Mm-hmm. And I love how you're working with it here, in the sense of suffering in many ways being self-caused by attachment and this lack of understanding about the impermanence of things. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, I think that the suffering people are going through right now amidst a pandemic is, at least on some tangible level, quite real. Mm-hmm. And so,
yes.
And so I'm wondering, how do we hold those two things together? The fact that suffering is in many ways a product of our own attachments, and that people are truly getting sick, suffering loss of income and jobs and so forth. Talk to me about those two different aspects of suffering.
Yeah. So the fact of kind of being in this kind of existence, sometimes I'll use the term being embodied, that we're here, it's inevitable that we will have bad things happen.
Right.
The fact that we're alive means that all of us are going to
get our turn on the wheel.
We're getting our turn on the wheel. We're all getting sick, we're growing old, and we're going to die.
Yeah.
And, it comes, the suffering that we kind of know as suffering, that everybody can identify as suffering, comes to everybody to a greater or lesser extent. Some people have a whole lot. Mm-hmm. Some people don't have as much. But everyone ends up with some.
Yeah.
And the key thing to understand here, though, is that these events happen to us. But what creates the extra suffering is the reactivity.
That's the second arrow.
That's the second arrow. And what you're referring to is kind of the metaphor, which is a metaphor that, Donald, one of my teachers, refers to a lot, which is shooting the second arrow, which is the first arrow is the actual experience. And that's often a negative thing, whether it's...
And you can't avoid getting shot by that arrow.
You can't avoid. I mean, you might get COVID,
right?
But you might get cancer, or you might end up needing a heart transplant, or someone close to you has just been killed in an automobile accident.
Right.
And those events occur, and they're incredibly painful. But then on top of that pain is how the mind relates to the suffering. How does it relate to those negative events? And that creates a whole nother layer of distress and suffering. The original suffering is painful. It causes distress.
Right. Life shoots us with the first arrow.
We
shoot ourselves with the second.
We always shoot ourselves with the second. And that's where mindfulness can be useful, is to not shoot yourself with the second arrow. And in fact, as you learn to not do that, the other thing that starts to occur that kind of co-occurs with the development of mindfulness is some other qualities of mind start to develop, like compassion, like love, like balance in the mind, which allows one to kind of relate to the first arrow, to the suffering that we all are going to experience in the world in a completely different way.
Say more about that. I mean, I've experienced that in my own practice, that there's more spaciousness around those events. And at least on my better days, less attachment. But at least they don't feel like they occupy the entire frame of my consciousness. Is that...
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. Like, the concept of spaciousness is really useful, because another way to kind of think about that is when things arise, again, a thought, image, body sensation, emotion, the metaphor I often use, it's as if, if your two hands are together, there's kind of the mind, and then there's the contents of the mind. The mind is one hand, the contents are the other. And when the mind is not mindful, when it's not aware, the hands clasp each other. The mind tends to grasp and just hold the contents of mind.
And they get conflated.
And you then get carried away by whatever arises. It's basically... whatever arises in the mind just pulls you around. But when you bring mindfulness, it's as if the hands are touching. One of my teachers talked about you rub experience. You're right there with it. You're not trying to push it away. You're not grabbing hold of it. You're just directly present with it, fully engaged. And this is important, because being mindful is not about pushing away pain or discomfort. It's being able to be completely present and fully engaged. And when you're able to do that, you're able to kind of be completely in the moment. And what it actually does is it conditions in these other qualities of mind, and it conditions in this sense of kind of being free yet engaged with what your experience is, even if it is painful and difficult.
There's a lot of pain and difficulty right now, and I suspect that folks who have any kind of proclivity toward anxiety and fear have that turned up to 11 at this point. Are you seeing that in your practice? Are you seeing folks who are having a great difficulty specifically because of this new set of circumstances we're in?
I'm kind of seeing a mixed bag. One of the things that has surprised me, because I was thinking that the people I see who struggle with anxiety would have a lot more anxiety, which has been the case for some. But what's been interesting is that the majority of people who I'm seeing who have anxiety problems, and whether that's they've had a lot of generalized anxiety or post-traumatic stress or panic attacks, their experience of this is kind of like, well, it's another form of anxiety that I have to learn to work with. They're not seeing it as this new different thing. I mean, some of them are like, well, just add it onto the pile. I already have OCD anxiety. I already have panic anxiety. And many of them, because they have learned to work with it, using mindfulness, using cognitive behavioral, techniques, using calming techniques, feel like, well, I can manage this as well.
So in some sense, they were prepared for this.
They were prepared for it because they've already learned how to work in some ways with their own suffering. I mean, it's one of the things about people who have psychological distress, on some level, even if they haven't been taught formal mindfulness meditation, have learned about mindfulness because they've learned to see things more clearly, which is they've learned to see negative mind states that arise they don't have to grab hold of. They don't have to be immersed in it all the time. And regardless of how they learned that, whether they were in psychodynamic psychotherapy or behavior therapy or learned it through intensive meditation practice, it ends up being the same way to relate to experience, and that lessens the distress.
That's really interesting, and it's a new thought for me, insofar as I, like many others, am finding myself in completely uncharted territory in terms of how I lead my daily life and how I try to help lead the Earth and Spirit Center and so forth. And yet what I think I hear you saying, at least in regard to your patients who struggle with anxiety, is that these circumstances may seem completely new and novel, and yet fear and anxiety there's continuity here in this virus compared to any other form of fear and anxiety.
Yes.
So it's different perhaps in degree, but not in kind.
That's exactly correct. I mean, it's as if, people spend a lot of time trying to, it's because we're conditioned to do this, trying to avoid pain and suffering. I mean, that's kind of a normal human
job description.
Human job description. We don't want it. That doesn't usually work so well because we're going to get it anyway, but we don't want it.
Yeah.
And
now we can't avoid it.
And now we can't avoid it. And, it's almost as if, we get, suffering comes at us in drips and drabs often. Mm-hmm. Sometimes a big event occurs. But then, you get something like this, and it's like we're trying to drink from a fire hose. The suffering is just pouring. And then, you get in touch with the fact that this is happening to every person on the planet.
Yeah.
I mean, the amount of suffering, that this is creating and disruption in people's lives, and it's monumental.
Right. It is. I mean, I just think we're going through this both individual and corporate trauma right now.
I mean, it's a trauma on so many levels, and one of the things that also I've seen that going back to the question about what I've seen with people is that. You see a lot of fear, and there's often a lot of panic, and it's calming down. But 2 weeks ago, people are starting to go to the stores and we're kind of faced with Armageddon. At the same time, there's tremendous compassion, even in people who are very distressed, who are caught in their own distress. They'll be feeling like, well, I'm worried about me getting sick and giving it to my aunt or my neighbor who's got arthritis and is on a, immunosuppressant, or the old people who live down the street. There's a lot of compassion. Mm-hmm. It's always been like when I've taught meditation, we often teach loving kindness and compassion practice. I have never felt that there's a lot of compassion deficit. I think it gets covered over a lot.
You mean just as part of the human condition?
In part of that, I think, okay. People can do bad things, but there's a lot of compassion, I think, around. It comes out in a moment like this.
Yeah.
What we don't have so much of is another quality of mind that gets cultivated by practicing mindfulness, which is a quality of mind called equanimity.
Yeah, so we're busy being compassionate when we're also having a panic attack.
Exactly. Well, that's exactly it. And the equanimity throws, it's that ability to have the mind balanced. And you want to kind of have equanimity with compassion and not be having the panic attack. So I emphasize a lot when I'm teaching people to kind of learn how to kind of be balanced regardless of what's happening, whether it's negative or even positive. And, some of the teachings they talk about dealing with what are called the worldly winds. And the worldly winds some of them are like praise and blame, honor and disrepute, all sorts of things like that. So, things can be good, things can be bad. Don't get too worked up about either one because, as we talked about, it's going to change. And you don't want to get too attached to any of it.
I challenge you to find me even 10 people who aren't pretty worked up about what's happening right now. But I do agree with you about the compassion being native and intuitive to us, and it gets covered over, as you said. But
yeah.
I think a lot of folks are having grocery store experiences these days because, of course, that's the only place we're going anymore.
Yeah.
And I remember one of my first trips out when this first started hitting, everyone was afraid. That's kind of the baseline, of course. Yeah. But everybody saw everybody else as an enemy of some sort. Right. Some kind of germ vector, somebody was going to buy the toilet paper before them.
Yeah.
And in a week's time, and maybe my experience is not universal, but in a week's time I felt the grocery store energy shift insofar as maybe folks realized, okay, we will probably get through this. But what felt deeper to me was that people weren't just seeing each other as the enemy or something to be afraid of, but there was a degree of kindness and gentleness. I remember just without thinking, I'm standing in the grocery store line and I thanked the checker for being on the front lines.
Yeah.
And I was not alone.
Yeah.
There were plenty of folks who I could tell had that same mind shift in a week's time.
Yeah. So like on my way over here, when I got off the highway, there was a sign. Somebody put a sign next to the road that said, "Thank you, grocery workers."
Yeah. Amen.
I mean, it's there's other things that kind of come up. The interconnectedness of everyone is here. I mean, this idea that like I am intimately connected to the person who stocks the shelves in the grocery store, and I'm intimately connected to the truck driver
who delivers the toilet paper,
and then the person who like worked at the mill, who cut down the tree, who made the toilet paper.
Yes.
And it's something that we lose sight of. And that's being brought to the fore because the suffering is right here in front of us. I mean, now the suffering's clear. Yeah. There's a well-known teacher who many people know. He's written many famous books. He's one of the most famous meditation teachers. His name's Thich Nhat Hanh. Mm-hmm. And he actually emphasizes this a lot. And in fact, he has people do a meditation where when they're eating, before you eat, you imagine everything that went into where this food came from.
His idea of interbeing.
It's interbeing, and this understanding that, it's all of these things that now are almost spontaneously occurring in people's minds because it's like, oh my gosh, we are completely interdependent.
We had taken all this stuff for granted. Yeah.
And we're all connected.
Yeah, I find myself wondering if we had to get this disconnected, literally physically disconnected from each other in order to see through this illusion or this delusion of us being separate selves.
Yeah. Well, it's going to be interesting to see how it all pans out kind of spiritually and psychologically for people. I mean, it's a wake-up call because, we really have to learn how to deal with a lot of pain and suffering. And there's a lot of pain and suffering that is just right here, right now. Yeah. And it's on so many levels. And it's really, I've been telling a lot of people, this is a time to kind of really reflect on what's important in your life and how you want to live from now on. This concept of living deliberately, living mindfully, moment to moment, now has a different relevance.
And a different urgency to it.
Yeah,
I think that we will look back on this moment and see it as pivotal, more pivotal, hopefully, than 9/11, than any number of places where we can remember exactly where we were when X happened. And I would love to be able to say 1, 2, 5, 10 years out, that we use this as an opportunity to become our better selves.
I think it's realistic to think that's going to happen. Not for everyone, but I think for a lot of people, this is going to be, a time where they, realize, look, I have to kind of change how I approach my reality, including my own mind, and maybe look at things differently.
I wonder if it's going to change the character of our television shows. Because I've noticed in the past several years that we have this amazing array of dystopian kinds of television where everything hits the fan and then everyone's at each other's throat and everything collapses and it's everyone for themselves against everyone else. And at least thus far, I don't feel like that's the dynamic that's playing out right now. And I'm wondering if that will change the zeitgeist in some regard.
Yeah, I think a lot of that comes from, it's almost like a way to desensitize your darkest fears. So, we kind of on a cultural level come up with our darkest fears and we project them out.
Onto television, right?
Yeah, well, it's kind of what's even happening with this. I mean, a lot of what everyone's experiencing right now, which creates the anxiety, is the unknown.
Yeah.
And when we don't know what's coming, and there's difficulty in just kind of being in the present moment and being aware of just what's happening in the moment, the mind will tend to fill in the blank. So when we think about the future, we just project our own inner fears into the future. This is going to happen or that's going to happen. And, the mind is great at kind of creating stories.
Unhelpful stories in a lot of cases.
Yeah, anybody who's actually done meditation for any length of time can see their mind come up with lots and lots of stories, and we create stories about what's going to happen.
What is the story you would love to tell about this time? Like, again, retrospectively, what do you hope the cultural story ends up being?
I think that because this kind of suffering is so there right now for everyone, is to really look closely at it without fear and to kind of then try to, say, okay, this is what reality is. And there is always going to be difficulty. Again, we're getting it through a fire hose right now.
Yeah.
But this is an opportunity to all of a sudden, in a more permanent way, in a deep way in people's minds, to shift how they view their own experience and really learn how to work with their suffering to help end it for themselves and other people. Which, again, it's right there. It's not far for most people. I mean, it's because we all have moments where we have great insight and where we have a lot of wisdom and we have a lot of deep understanding. It's just that we get kind of carried away by the not so good conditioning in our minds and then get lost again for a bit. But it's there. Enlightenment isn't far away. It just seems that way, but it's really not. And in the moment, when we tap into being in the present and when we see, we're maybe being too reactive, we can start to see the compassion arise in ourselves. And I think that, there's a possibility that could happen. Mm-hmm. We'll see.
Well, if someone didn't get scared off in the first few minutes of this interview by hearing about your experience of meditating 2 hours a day, and I include myself in that group of wanting to run and hide, if someone's still with us and does not have a regular meditation practice, what are some practical tips or tools you might suggest either to establish some kind of practice? What are some survival tips that you could offer to a novice who may not be able to commit to the kind of time that would be ideal?
So, I think it's important that if you practice to do some degree of a formal sitting every day, even if it's 10 minutes, because it helps to have kind of that continuity for 10 minutes where the only thing you're focused on is how to be mindful of the moment, be present with the moment, even if you're just being mindful of your breathing.
Right. And even 10 minutes, I hear, on a regular basis, even that can rewire your brain.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's clear benefits. And then what you can do with that 10-minute period of time, and I emphasize this a lot in how I teach, is that quality of mind, you can experience what it's like to be mindful. Even, in 10 minutes, maybe you're only really mindful for 2 minutes. Well, in those 2 minutes, you've experienced what being present and mindful is like. So then you can bring it into daily activity.
Do we even have daily activity anymore?
You have daily activity. It can be walking to your car. It can be doing the dishes. It can be folding the laundry. You can bring mindfulness. You can bring the same quality of mind that you have during a formal sitting practice into those activities. It helps to slow down a little bit when you do those activities. But I explain to people, if they fold towels slowly and mindfully, being aware of the movement of their body, feeling the texture of the towel in their hand, noting exactly what's happening, that counts just as much as sitting on the cushion. It's not different. It all counts.
Not only does it count, I think, but it counts not just for one's individual well-being. And I may get a little esoteric here, but I feel like as we cultivate mindfulness personally through the folding of towels or the time on the cushion, whether it's 10 minutes or 2 hours, that not only are we able to move through our own lives with more grace and graciousness, but that it somehow, in a way that I can't understand or explain, it affects the larger equation as well. And I'm not just saying because my behavior is different out in the social world. Even if I stayed at home and still cultivated this different state of mind, that somehow contributes to a different level of, again, I don't know how to put words around this, but a different energy in the air.
Yeah, well, we could kind of go down a rabbit hole talking about this.
And we only have a minute, so.
Well, that's a great question to put at the end. So, I mean, I think that kind of going back to one of my earlier points. I mean, when the mind becomes really crystal clear and you see the self clearly, meaning what's arising, then sometimes the whole idea of kind of the boundaries between oneself and others maybe are not as clear as you think they are.
And therefore, the webs of causality may look really different than we thought they looked.
Absolutely. And things are maybe not as separate as they seem. I mean, it goes back to what we were talking about with Thich Nhat Hanh and interbeing. There's a level of connectedness that our normal everyday minds don't really see that clearly.
Right.
But can be experienced.
Such that if all that is ours to do right now is to care for a loved one and keep them safe, or to tend to our children who are now at home trying to school online, even if we may feel helpless in the face of something as global and seemingly unstoppable as a pandemic, if we do what's ours to do, even in those quote-unquote small realms, that does impact the larger frame.
Absolutely. And that can include stocking the shelves at Kroger
it definitely
at midnight,
includes that.
Or filling up a semi-truck with gasoline at 4 a.m. in the middle of Nebraska. I mean, that is connectedness. It's just, can you see it that way or not?
Well, Chris, I am grateful to be connected to you. I'm grateful for this good conversation. I hope that our listeners have found many things helpful in this time. I know that I have. So I want to wish you well. I know that you go through this time with an open heart and that you are helping many people. So thank you for all that you do and all that you are.
Well, thanks, Kyle. And thanks for everything you do, too.
The Earth and Spirit podcast is a production of the Earth and Spirit Center, a nonprofit interfaith spirituality center in Louisville, Kentucky, devoted to cultivating a flourishing world through contemplative practice. This podcast is made possible by the generous support of the Calliopeia Foundation, whose mission is to reconnect ecology, culture, and spirituality through grant-making, education, and media initiatives. Joe Brown is our audio engineer, Parker Bowling provides production help, and I'm your host, Kyle Kramer. To learn more about the Earth and Spirit Center, please visit our website, www.earthandspiritcenter.org.